Welcome to the Doherty Water for Food podcast. Since 2010, the Doherty Water for Food Global Institute at the University of Nebraska has worked toward one goal, a food and water secure world. One in which global food security is ensured without compromising the use of water to meet other essential human and environmental needs. It's a daunting vision, but one that is vitally important. This podcast amplifies the voices of those making waves in this space. We hope you enjoy today's episode.
Welcome to the Water for Food podcast. My name is Arianna Elnes. I am the communications specialist at the Doherty Water for Food Global Institute at the University of Nebraska. And today I'm thrilled to sit down with one of our faculty fellows, Dave Aiken. Dave is a professor of agricultural economics at UNL's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources, and his research areas include water law and policy, energy law, environmental law, and global warming. Thank you, Dave, for joining me today. And I wanted to talk to Dave because there are, first of all, so many hot topic water headlines, and we often talk about them in terms of conservation, agriculture, and management. But we'd be remiss to exclude something that really shapes a lot of modern day water management, and that is the law. So I'm excited to talk to you today about the fundamental elements that affect water management, as well as some interesting cases happening in Nebraska today. So first, Dave, could you give our listeners some background on yourself, what led you to UNL, and what got you interested in your specialty?
When I started college in the late 1960s, the environmental movement was just kind of kicking off in the United States, becoming kind of a national thing. And so that was something that kind of intrigued me a little bit. While I was in college, I read Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, and at the end, which was a number one bestseller back then. And towards the end, he said, with all these problems associated with pollution and all this other stuff, we're going to have a new legal specialty called environmental law. And I thought, oh, that sounds cool. So I said, all right, when I graduate from college, I'm going to go learn how to be an environmental law guy. So I went to George Washington in Washington, D.C., and they had a very extensive curriculum in environmental law. And so it was a great place for me to go. While I was in law school, the last 2 years, I worked as a law clerk at U.S. Department of Agriculture, where I worked for two lawyers who were writing a 3-volume treatise of Western water law. So I learned a lot about water law, state by state, working there at USDA. After I took the bar exam in D.C., I went to the college placement office and found a notice that the University of Nebraska was looking for a new person to come in water law in the College of Agriculture. So I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. I'm from Nebraska, so why not? Shoot them a resume and see what they say. And ended up getting the job. That was 48 years ago. So,
wow.
So it was a long time.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
And you study law surrounding a variety of natural resources, but we're talking today about, of course, water laws. So why should we be interested in the law surrounding water?
Well, first, in natural resources, all this stuff is interconnected. And we need to drink water. We have to have clean, safe water to drink, which is a lot of times an issue. We need water, either precip or irrigation, for crops. So water is very important. It's also very important environmentally. Water quality is a big deal. That was just happening in the 1970s. It's become a very big deal in agriculture over the years. Nebraska has been a leader in terms of trying to come up with policies to help deal with water quality and groundwater. It's a big issue, but it's one that touches on so many things that are really important. And since we're on the eastern edge of the Great American Desert, we understand that there's not always water there, all the water you need all the time. And so when you're short, then how are you going to handle
that? So could you give us sort of a water law 101? What are some of the terms that people should know? What are some of the legal histories that our listeners should be aware of in terms of the state of drought and water in the U.S. today?
Okay, well, I'll go back to the Great American Desert, and water is a limiting resource here. If you don't have enough water, it's going to be desert. And that's not necessarily the case throughout Nebraska, but it is certainly the case throughout much of the West. And so who gets to use the water? And what happens when there's not enough? And there's almost always not going to be enough. That's where American water law developed. And it's called the law of prior appropriation. And what that means is that first in time is first in right. So it's who starts using the water first has the first claim on the water, and people who come later take subject to that first claim. And so when that drought hits, there's not enough for the newcomers and the old-timers. The old-timers get the water because they've got the oldest water rights. The oldest water rights are called senior water rights, and that's better than old fogey water rights. And then the younger ones are junior water rights, which is better than, adolescent or teenage water rights. So it can get very complicated in a hurry, but those are the fundamental things. And the issues that the West is facing on the Colorado River, one of the big issues is that the Imperial Irrigation District in Southern California has the senior water right on the Colorado River. And so they are, they can claim the entire flow of the river if that's what they need to satisfy their water right. They don't have to cut back because it's a drought. They are entitled to the full amount. And that means that all the irrigators will get shut off, but some of the cities will get shut off too. We haven't seen the final chapter yet of what's happening on the Colorado River, but that's why there has been so little progress in terms of trying to deal with the looming shortages that are really a big deal.
Can you talk about the difference between surface water and groundwater and why one would be managed through allocation and one would be managed through more of a local management?
The big difference is the time of travel. Water coming down the stream, if it's a wet stream, then, it's how many miles, tens or, scores of miles per day. If I'm the junior appropriator and I get shut off, the senior appropriator will probably get the water tomorrow, if not sooner. Whereas with wells, with groundwater is under natural conditions is feet per year. Now, when wells are pumping and you've got a big irrigation well, I've got a big irrigation well, and we share a fence line, we're both moving the water from the fence line towards our well, and I'm trying to pull it from under your land, and you're trying to pull it from under my land and stuff. So it's moving a little faster, but it's not going that far. So that time of travel is the big difference and the big reason why groundwater is managed differently.
Okay, so surface water moves, it's easy to measure in cubic feet per second and allocate based on that measurement. Groundwater basically stays put.
Pretty much. Yeah.
And so it's easier to manage based on local jurisdictions. Okay, that makes sense. So there are two compacts that were written about the same time that are causing some state stress right now. And that is the Colorado Compact around the Colorado River, which we now know is overallocated, and the South Platte River Compact, which we'll get to in a minute. What were the philosophies around these compacts, and why are we needing to revisit them today?
When they negotiated the Colorado River Compact, they had specific problems in mind, that they wanted to fix with the compact. And for the Colorado River, it was, how much water are all the states going to get? California wanted a deal where if other states like Arizona and Nevada and stuff weren't using their share, that California could use it, get the extra water that was being unused. But the other states say, well, but that doesn't mean you get to keep it. When we're ready to use it, we get it back. But they couldn't predict the future any better than we can. It's a best guess based on what we know. And that's what they did. They did the best they could with the information they had. In the 1920s, it's not like we had records, stream flow records on these rivers going back 50 years. And it turned out the records that they had for the Colorado River were a high flow, period. And it was not indicative of the long-term average. And so they allocated the water based on these high flow numbers. They said, oh, great, there's plenty for everybody, they thought. And especially based on what everybody was using at the time, they said, oh, well, we'll never run short. Until demand over time exploded with all the big cities in California and Arizona. And the long-term average was way less than they expected. And so, now we're in this 1,200-year drought in the Colorado Basin. And it has not been like this since anybody has been watching the water in the Colorado River. So now they're just about ready to run out, and it's a big deal.
Okay, so water is, in a way, a wild compound, which moves and can at any time be a solid, a liquid, or a gas. Why is it then that water is allocated in cubic feet and not by percentages?
That's a good question. The early compacts, like the South Platte and the Colorado, they used fixed amounts, either flow amounts like cubic feet per second or quantity amounts like acre feet. After a few compacts, they figured out that, this really may not be the best way to do it. So now the compacts are written with percentages. For example, the Republican compact, we get 49, Kansas gets 40%, and Colorado gets 11%. If there's lots of water, everybody gets the same percent, but that's the same percent of a lot more water, so everybody gets more water. When it's dry, everybody gets cut back. Most would agree that that's a fair approach.
Mm-hmm. But in the meantime, we're still held to these antiquated...
In those other compacts, yeah, unless they're renegotiated, what's on the page is what it is.
Can you talk about Nebraska's approach to water management and what context helped set up the legal framework for local water management?
We follow prior appropriation for surface water. And so we're like just about every other Western state that follows, they all follow prior appropriation for surface water. Groundwater is very different, and the groundwater law is very different. There's kind of two groups. There's the states like Nebraska and Texas and Arizona and California that have a lot of groundwater. They have gone more of a local control approach where the state agency doesn't say who gets water and who doesn't, who's senior, who's junior, and stuff like that. They go a different way, and they basically try to manage it as a common resource. And so that's why in Nebraska we've got the natural resource districts. They're basically our implementation of that local control approach, and they have broad responsibilities for groundwater. The one aspect that deviates from that a little bit is when we were in the lawsuit with Kansas over the Republican River. We came up on the short end of that lawsuit. And one of the things that the legislature did in response to that situation was we're going to give the Department of Natural Resources the authority, to do a check every year to see if there are so many groundwater wells pumping within each river basin that over time that pumping could harm the stream flow in that river basin. And when that happens, then they can say, okay, this basin is fully appropriated or over appropriated, and cut off new high-capacity wells within that basin. And so that was kind of a big step away from local control. But it was in response to the mess that we got ourselves in on the Republican River with Kansas. And so now, I guess maybe close to 60% of the state, there's a ban on new high-capacity wells. There's some limited exceptions for municipal uses, but, that's about it. So if we've got, if an ethanol plant comes in, they can't drill a well, they have to buy out an irrigator to get the water from their well or to get the right transferred, to wherever the ethanol plant is, so they pump the water and the farmer can't, because he sold them his water right, that kind of thing.
So I wanted to sit down with you today because, as you know, there's an interesting case going on in Nebraska right now, which started about 100 years ago around the South Platte River. The headwaters of the South Platte River start southwest of Denver, Colorado, in a place called Perkins County, and it actually flows north through Denver and then rounds northeast through Colorado's agricultural land, and it flows through the state of Nebraska, where it eventually joins into the North Platte River. Could you give a brief history of the South Platte River Compact between Nebraska and Colorado?
Sure. It all started with the Western Canal, which diverts water from the South Platte River in Colorado into southwest Nebraska. It supplies water to irrigators both in Colorado and in Nebraska. And it turns out that the Western Canal has a senior water right on the South Platte River. But the Colorado state engineer was ignoring the Western Canal's request, to shut off the junior appropriators because they were all Colorado appropriators. So Nebraska filed a lawsuit. And Colorado said, okay, let's have a compact and we can work that out better than probably through some lawsuit. And so that was where the compact came from. In 1923, one of the first things that the compact did was that it divided the South Platte, for purposes of the contract, into two parts. There's the upper 75%, which I call the Denver reach. And then there's the lower 25%, which we'll call the Nebraska reach. And Nebraska has no water rights in the Denver reach, but we do have limited water rights in the Nebraska reach. So Colorado agreed that, yes, we'll administer the junior appropriators in Colorado so that the Western Canal gets its water during the irrigation season. They said, and we know that you guys are working on building another canal, the Perkins County Canal, to Nebraska. So we will agree to give you 500 cubic feet per second during the non-irrigation season, subject to the right of Colorado to, do some development of its own. But, basically you have that 500 cubic feet per second for that Perkins County Canal. And Perkins County Canal was never built. They ran out of money to do it, but now Denver's proposing stuff, and everybody's excited about the South Platte River now.
So last year, Governor Pete Ricketts proposed that Nebraska move forward with building the Perkins Canal, which was held off since probably around 1925, let's say.
Yeah.
Okay, so the governor said we should move forward with this. What spurred that move?
Denver is, the suburbs are growing. Denver's growing. It's a lot of people, and they are seeing that they are going to be short on water down the road. And what they'd been doing in the past was that they would go and buy water rights from farmers. And so the farmers would go to dryland farming, which is, basically very poor pasture. That's all it was. So it wasn't worth a whole lot for ag production. And at the rate Denver was going, in 30 or 40 or 50 years, there would be very little irrigated agriculture left in the South Platte Basin. It would all be bought by the cities. And ag group said, isn't there something else you can do? Can't you try something else? Because we really want to try to, we think it's important to Colorado to have, the South Platte Basin is where the vast majority of our ag production comes from, because of the irrigation. And so the state did a study to say, if we only gave Nebraska just what they're legally entitled to under the compact and no more, how much water would we have that could be used in Colorado and could be used by Denver? So they did that, and the estimates were between 400 CFS and 500 CFS. So remember, 500 CFS is, what we get for the Perkins County Canal. So they say, oh, well, that's good. We can use that water and avoid having to shut down all the agriculture in the South Platte. We still might have to do some of that, But if we do this first, then they'll know that we've done everything we can to avoid taking the water out of agriculture in the South Platte. So they proposed a sort of a conceptual study where they would basically dry the river up when it gets to the county line that divides the Denver part from the Nebraska part. Just before the water hits that dividing line, they're going to suck as much of it out of the river as they can and then pipe it back up the valley, up the mountains to Denver, and then run it through the system again. That would by itself reduce the winter flows into Nebraska pretty considerably. Now, this project is a long way off. It's billions of dollars in expense. They've probably got to get 15 or 20 or 25 suburbs to work with Denver on it. And then the environmental impact, there's a lot. They can't start work on this tomorrow. I mean, it's perhaps decades down the road. It's a bold proposal. It's something that they could do if they decided that that's what they needed to do. And so the governor got the briefing, and they said, from a water rights perspective, our best shot is trying to do something with that Perkins County Canal. So he says, great, we've got some financial flexibility because of the COVID money that all the states have gotten. So we can move things around a little bit, and let's go after this Perkins County Canal.
And so what is sort of the legal trajectory, or what are the possible outcomes for the Perkins County Canal?
We are getting what we're legally entitled to under the compact. They would still have to honor the commitment to the Western Canal, the 120 CFS that we're entitled to. Now, it may be that the water coming down, from the Denver part to the Nebraska part, the lower part, we're under 120 CFS a lot during the irrigation season because of how much they've taken upstream. And then Nebraska would have an argument, not a great argument, but an argument that, you're drastically changing the flow regime in the upper three-fourths of the river, and we have some rights to have that flow pattern largely maintained as it's been. And Colorado will say, well, sure, that's fine, but you only have water rights in the bottom 25%. You don't have any water rights above that part of the river in the Denver reach. So we can do whatever we want. And that would not be an unreasonable interpretation of the compact. Right now, we get water that comes down in the non-irrigation season, basically in the winter and the spring. And that's great. It's kind of free water into Nebraska. It charges lands in the South Platte River Basin in Nebraska. It recharges groundwater there. And if that were cut off, that would definitely affect the groundwater supplies in Nebraska. Legally, we have to play the hand that we're dealt. And the hand that we're holding is not there to guarantee that we're going to win this one and that make them continue the flows into Nebraska. Because they don't want to. They want to just make sure we just get the bare minimum, which is all they're legally required to do. That's what they want to do. But we're going to make it a little more challenging for them. And, if we can negotiate something with them, then we don't have to spend $500 million. And they can do largely what they want to do in Denver, but you have to get them to the table. And it's just like the 1923 compact. We said, you've got to recognize the senior right for the Western Canal. And they said, we don't want to. So we said, fine, we'll sue you. And we filed a lawsuit, and they say, would you guys like to negotiate something on this? We may see history repeat itself.
Super interesting. This has been illuminating, and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for joining us this time on the Doherty Water for Food podcast. Make sure to visit our website, waterforfood.nebraska.edu, to view show notes or subscribe so you don't miss future episodes.